Jonathan Blake was a name known to millions. His face graced billboards, television screens, and cinema posters worldwide. His acting had captivated audiences for over a decade, with fans flocking to theaters just to see the latest film he starred in. Jonathan had it all: fame, fortune, and the kind of public adoration most people could only dream of. His life seemed flawless, a carefully crafted image of the perfect actor, the kind of man everyone admired, adored, and wanted to be close to. But beneath the surface, there was a different story, one that only a select few knew. Amelia Harper had been one of Jonathan's most devoted fans for years. From the very first film she saw him in, she felt an undeniable connection. It wasn't just his looks or the way he portrayed his characters. It was the vulnerability he brought to every role, the sense that behind his confident smile there was something more, a complexity that drew her in. She had followed his career from the beginning, attending film premieres, reading every magazine interview, and consuming every piece of media about him she could find. To Amelia, Jonathan wasn't just an actor. He was a figure of fascination, someone who seemed so out of reach, yet somehow so perfect. She lived a quiet, somewhat solitary life in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, working as a graphic designer. She had a few close friends, but none of them shared her level of obsession with Jonathan. To them, he was just another celebrity. But to Amelia, he was a symbol of something she longed for: connection, excitement, and an escape from her ordinary life. She would spend countless hours on fan forums, discussing his films with others who shared her passion, and daydreaming about what it would be like to meet him in person, to actually be seen by him. Then, one day, the impossible happened. Jonathan was scheduled to attend a charity event in the city, and Amelia managed to get a ticket. The night of the event was everything she had imagined. Elegant, exciting, full of familiar faces. The moment she walked into the grand hall, she felt as though she had stepped into one of Jonathan's films. Everything seemed so surreal, but then, as if by fate, she caught his eye. Jonathan was standing near the stage, surrounded by a crowd of people when their eyes met. It was a brief moment, fleeting even, but in that instant everything seemed to stop. Amelia's heart raced, her pulse quickening. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a split second she felt like she mattered. It wasn't just a glance. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. And then he smiled. The smile lingered, and for the first time Amelia felt a connection with him that went beyond the screen. Her mind raced. Was it possible? Could he have recognized her from the countless fan photos and events she had attended? Or was it something else? Something that couldn't be explained. After the event ended, Amelia was about to leave when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Jonathan standing there, his charming smile still in place. "I couldn't help but notice you in the crowd," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "Would you like to join me for a drink?" Amelia's heart nearly stopped. Was this really happening? Was this the moment she had fantasized about for years? She had no idea what to say, but all she could do was nod, unable to hide the excitement flooding her veins. Little did she know, that single moment would change her life forever. Their conversation that night was innocent at first, talking about the event, the causes Jonathan supported, and the life he led as a celebrity. But as they spoke, the world around them seemed to fade. Jonathan was unlike the man she had seen on television. He was real, vulnerable, and, for the first time, someone she could see as a person, not just a famous figure. Amelia found herself opening up too, talking about her own life and the connection she felt to his work. She hadn't planned on saying so much, but something about him made her feel comfortable, like they were old friends catching up. As the evening wore on, they exchanged contact details. Jonathan, smiling again, told her, "Let's keep in touch. It's not every day I meet someone who truly gets me." Amelia left the event that night in a daze, her mind spinning. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Jonathan Blake, the man she had idolized for so long, had spoken to her as if she were someone special. The possibility of something more began to take root in her mind. Little did she know that this encounter would not only change her life, but set in motion a chain of events that would blur the lines between fan and lover, between admiration and obsession. After that night, Amelia's life took on a surreal quality. Every moment felt heavy with anticipation, as though she were waiting for something to unfold, yet unsure of what it would be. The following days passed in a blur, the memory of Jonathan's smile etched in her mind, replaying over and over. She checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a message, a call, anything to make the connection between them feel real. And then it happened. A text message appeared on her screen one evening. "Hey, Amelia, it's Jonathan. I really enjoyed our chat the other night. Would you like to meet again sometime? Maybe for coffee?" Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Was this real? She had dreamed about a moment like this for years, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to respond. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she typed a simple reply. "I'd love to. When?" The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. Jonathan and Amelia began meeting regularly, each encounter more intimate than the last. They started with casual coffee dates, small outings to quiet parks where they could talk without the prying eyes of the public. Jonathan would share stories from his life, tales of the pressures of fame, the loneliness that came with being constantly watched by millions, and the constant struggle to maintain an image that never quite felt like his own. Amelia, in turn, listened with rapt attention. She could sense the vulnerability in his words, the hidden pain beneath his charming facade. There was something about the way he spoke to her, so open, so real, that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world who truly understood him. It was a connection she had never experienced before, one that was intoxicating in its intensity. At first, their meeting seemed innocent enough, friendship perhaps, but soon something shifted. Jonathan would reach out to her between their dates, sending little texts or voicemails, checking in on her day. He began to open up more, sharing personal details he had never mentioned before. Amelia found herself falling deeper into the world of Jonathan Blake, unable to resist the magnetic pull of their growing bond. One evening, after a quiet dinner at a secluded restaurant, Jonathan leaned across the table, his eyes searching hers. "You know, it's rare that I find someone I can talk to like this," he said softly, his voice tinged with something deeper. "Most people don't get it. They don't really know me, you know? But with you, I feel like I can just be myself." The sincerity in his words sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. She couldn't deny the feelings that had begun to take root in her heart. She had always admired him from afar, but now, with every shared conversation, every lingering touch, those feelings were transforming into something far more complicated. She wasn't just his fan anymore. She was something more, someone important to him. And that idea consumed her. But as the relationship deepened, so did the danger. Amelia was no longer just an admirer from a distance. She was becoming a part of Jonathan's private world, a world that by its very nature had to remain hidden. Every time they met, a sense of guilt washed over her. She could see the way Jonathan looked over his shoulder, always checking for photographers or fans who might catch a glimpse of them together. There was always the unspoken knowledge that their meetings had to remain secret. Despite this, Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging when she was with him. With Jonathan, she felt seen, valued, and special. She began to daydream about a life with him outside of the public's eye, one where they could be together without the constant fear of exposure. But she also knew that if anyone found out about their relationship, especially the media, it would destroy everything. Jonathan's career, his image, everything he had worked so hard to build would be torn apart. The idea of their secret being exposed haunted her, but in her heart, Amelia believed that their connection was worth the risk. Jonathan had always warned her that their bond had to remain under wraps. The press would twist their relationship, he said, turning something pure into a scandal. But Amelia didn't care. She was falling for him, falling so fast that nothing else seemed to matter anymore. The danger only added to the allure. The secrecy, the stolen moments. It made their time together feel all the more precious, all the more intense. What started as a simple meeting between a fan and her idol was quickly evolving into something that neither of them could control. Their connection was undeniable, but as the stakes grew higher, so did the tension. Each meeting, each secret conversation brought them closer, but also pulled them further into a world that neither of them could escape. The risk of exposure loomed over them, a constant shadow, but it only seemed to make the bond between them more dangerous. As their secret meetings continued, the line between fantasy and reality blurred for Amelia. What had started as an innocent infatuation had quickly morphed into something far more intense. She no longer saw herself just as a fan. She had become an integral part of Jonathan's life, a confidant, a source of solace. The more time they spent together, the more she realized how deeply she had fallen for him. She felt a rush of emotion every time they met, a mixture of excitement, fear, and desire. Jonathan was no longer just an actor on a screen. He was real, he was in front of her, and he was hers, if only for a fleeting moment. But with each passing day, the weight of their secret grew heavier. Amelia found herself torn between the joy of being close to him and the guilt that gnawed at her conscience. She had promised herself that she would remain silent, that she would keep their affair a secret, but the fear of getting caught began to seep into every part of her life. She started avoiding her friends, ignoring invitations to social events, always worried that someone might notice she was missing, that someone might ask too many questions. Her world began to shrink, becoming smaller and smaller as she focused entirely on Jonathan. She even began to change the way she lived. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of her own personality, now felt like a prison. She spent hours thinking about Jonathan, replaying their conversations in her mind, analyzing every look, every word. She had started making small sacrifices, canceling little white lies to her family, canceling plans to stay in touch with him. In the quiet hours of the night, she would scroll through his social media pages, reading every interview, every tweet, looking for clues about his life, searching for something that might bring her closer to him. Jonathan, too, was feeling the strain. His emotions were in turmoil, and he found himself at a crossroads. He had always known that being with someone like Amelia was risky, but he never anticipated how deeply his feelings for her would develop. At first, their time together had been a welcome escape, a break from the pressures of fame. Amelia had been like a breath of fresh air, someone who didn't want anything from him except his company. She listened to him without judgment, something that was rare in his world of constant scrutiny. But now, as their relationship grew more intense, Jonathan began to realize how much he had to lose. Every time they met, he could feel the weight of their secrecy pressing down on him. He had to be cautious, always looking over his shoulder, making sure no one saw them together. The fear of exposure became all-consuming. He could feel the walls closing in on him, his public image hanging by a thread. The thought of his fans finding out, of his career being shattered, was enough to make him pull away, to distance himself. Yet, despite the fear, he couldn't deny the connection he felt with Amelia. She made him feel seen in a way that no one else could. He had tried to keep things casual, tried to remind himself that this was just a temporary escape, but the reality was much harder to ignore. He cared for her, deeply, and the more they spent time together, the more he questioned the path his life had taken. He had always been in control of his public image, always managed to keep his personal life out of the spotlight. But Amelia was different. She had gotten under his skin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was becoming more than just a fleeting affair. But there was no turning back now. The stakes were too high. He couldn't afford to let the world see who he was when he wasn't on camera, not without risking everything he had worked for. And yet, every time they were together, he felt a pull he couldn't resist. Their stolen moments became more frequent, more intense, and with each passing encounter, Amelia began to lose herself in the fantasy of their relationship. She had begun to see their affair as something real, something that could become permanent, even though deep down she knew the truth. It was fragile, built on lies and secrecy, and destined to crumble under the weight of their actions. In the silence of the night, as Amelia lay awake thinking about Jonathan, she realized that she had become someone she didn't recognize. She had sacrificed pieces of herself, her friendships, her integrity, her sense of self, just to be closer to him. She had pushed aside everything that once mattered to her, and now all she could think about was Jonathan, and the life that seemed more and more impossible with each passing day. The weight of the secret grew unbearable as time passed. Jonathan and Amelia continued their affair, each meeting filled with both longing and anxiety. Jonathan, once confident and in control, now found himself constantly on edge. The public eye was always watching, and he could feel the creeping pressure of exposure threatening to destroy everything he had worked for. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line. But despite the fear, there was no denying the way he felt about Amelia. She had become someone essential to him, someone who gave him the space to breathe, to be himself in a world that never let him relax. But it was becoming harder and harder to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Their secret meetings, their stolen moments, started to feel like a game they were both losing. Jonathan tried to keep his distance, to push Amelia away, but she would not be deterred. Each time he pulled back, she seemed to draw closer, unable or unwilling to see the danger that loomed over them. It was as though she had become consumed by the idea of them, by the fantasy they had built. She told herself it was worth it, this closeness, this connection. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was all slipping out of control. Jonathan began canceling their plans, giving excuses about work or personal commitments. But Amelia could feel the shift, the way he pulled away emotionally, leaving her in a state of confusion and longing. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional wall he had started to build between them. She didn't know what to think. She had always believed that their connection was real, something beyond just an affair. But now she wasn't so sure. She was constantly left wondering if he had grown tired of her, or worse, if he had never truly felt anything for her at all. The tension between them was palpable. They still communicated, but the conversations felt more forced, more distant. Jonathan would reach out only when it was convenient for him, as though he were trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. But Amelia was no longer content with being the one to bend to his schedule. She had already sacrificed too much, given too much of herself. She began to question whether their affair was even worth the cost. Was it worth losing herself in a world of secrecy, fear, and guilt? It wasn't long before the cracks in their relationship started to show in public as well. Amelia couldn't help but notice that Jonathan seemed more aloof during their rare public encounters. When they went to the few events they still attended together, he was always scanning the crowd, looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to find out. His discomfort made her feel small, invisible, like a guilty secret she wasn't meant to be, and she hated that feeling. The more Jonathan withdrew, the more desperate she became to hold on, to make their secret love something real. Her obsession with him grew even more dangerous. Amelia started taking greater risks to be near him. She began showing up at his favorite places, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to get a chance to talk, even if only for a few minutes. But she was no longer just a fan who admired him from afar. She had crossed into a territory where her love for him had become all-consuming. She couldn't see the line between devotion and obsession anymore. All she could think about was him, and the thought of losing him terrified her. Jonathan, meanwhile, was sinking into a quiet despair of his own. Every interaction with Amelia felt like an obligation, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. He missed the carefree days when he had first met her, when their connection had felt so effortless. Now it was suffocating. The constant fear of exposure, the strain of maintaining a secret life, it was all too much. But he couldn't bring himself to end things. There was still a part of him that longed for the escape she provided, the comfort of her presence. The conflict between his love for her and the reality of his fame tore at him. One evening things came to a head. Amelia had arranged another clandestine meeting, this time at a small, quiet cafe where they could be alone. Jonathan had agreed, though his reluctance was evident. He arrived late, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He barely acknowledged her when he sat down. For the first time, Amelia felt the full weight of his indifference. She had always been able to read him, but now she saw only walls. "Jonathan," she said softly, trying to break the silence. "What's going on? You've been distant. I don't understand. I thought we had something." He looked at her, his gaze cold. "You don't understand the pressure, Amelia," he said, his voice tight. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." His words hit her like a blow. She felt a cold rush of realization. This wasn't just about their secret anymore. This was about him not wanting her anymore. The thought left her breathless, dizzy. The connection she had held onto so desperately, the love she thought they shared, was crumbling before her eyes. She sat there frozen as Jonathan stood up and walked away, leaving her in the cafe, alone with nothing but the realization of what they had become. Two people lost in the consequences of their choices,